We have such a special guest today. I'm so glad that you're joining us. We are going to be chatting with Patrick Lindsay. And I did my best to do a reasonable length bio of this man, but leaving things out would not have done him justice. He truly is a legend, definitely in Australia and in the world of media. You may have heard of him, and if you haven't, you probably know his work. Patrick Lindsay's got a long career in print and television journalism. He's been a TV presenter, a producer, a writer, and he's become one of Australia's leading non-fiction authors. He's published over 21 non-fiction books, and I've enjoyed a few of them. He is a prolific best-selling author. He's now a filmmaker, a speaker. He's written bestsellers, for example, The Spirit of Kokoda, Back from the Dead, which is on the Bali bombings. And the book that I get to chat with him in this podcast is on the Spirit of Gallipoli. So we're going to Gallipoli and we talk about the bravery of those men and the folly of war and what can we learn from it and what it gives us today in 2021 as a result of the sense of duty that went on back then. And we go into talking about whether that same sense of duty would carry through today. He is a professional observer who writes on topics that are close, I believe, to Australian and New Zealand hearts and for hearts around the world. He has a message that I think is universal. He shares inspiring messages of wisdom through his motivational series that he wrote for his grandchildren, but are now bestsellers. And he gives us reminders that within us lies the power to change our lives for the better. He's definitely the eternal optimist. He was involved with the hit TV series In Their Footsteps that you might be familiar with. And he also is the creator of the documentary film Kokoda, The Spirit Lives, which premiered back in 2018, is now available through Amazon Prime. He's also the founding director. We didn't get to talk with him about this as I would like to. He's the founding director and was chairman of the Kokoda Track Foundation, which aims to repay the selfish help given to Australia and the diggers around World War II by the beloved Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels of Papua New Guinea. And in 2015, he was named a member of the Order of Australia for, and I'm quoting, significant service to the media as a television presenter and journalist, to international relations, and to literature as an author. And he is certainly prolific and passionate and an advocate for people who need support. So he's doing amazing work. He's got a new movie coming out shortly, The Home Front, which is a film looking at what we can do to support people who are coming home who are returned servicemen. And we go into Gallipoli, we go into Kokoda, and we look at those wars and those campaigns. We talk about the philosophy of war and what it means for us today and the fortune we have today, which is almost self-evident. We do a little bit of Trump ranting, which is always good for a podcast. We look at politics and the effects of social media on it. We touch on that. We talk about the way he thinks and how he approaches things. And this podcast to me at its heart is about different ways of thinking. And I just enjoy so much chatting with him. And I trust you get some value out of meeting and getting up close with Patrick Lindsay. It's so great that you're joining us here today. Thank you, Patrick. I'm in awe of you.
Oh, thank you very much, Sharon. It's my pleasure.
I think there'll be so many viewers who'll be so pleased to hear more about the behind the scenes of your creative process and what inspires you, because there's so much depth and richness to what you explore. It's fascinating.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you. Yes, it's a bit of a, well, you could look at it that way, or it's a bit of a dog's breakfast too, isn't it?
How do you look at it?
I look at it as a continuing journey, basically. I think it's an exploration. And I think my basic philosophy is probably that it's never too late. So there's always something to learn. There's always something to challenge yourself with. And I think everything that I've done there seemed to be some sort of logical progression from one to the next, I think.
At the time or in hindsight?
In hindsight. Not a lot at the time. Although it's funny, sometimes I'm a bit of a sort of an imaginer, and then I try to envisage things and kind of, I think my only real claim, I don't think I'm any particularly good at anything, but I'm a pretty good observer. So that's where I pick up a lot of the stuff, is just by widening my view a bit and then observing stuff. And I think as a result of that, I'll often think, oh, that'd be interesting. And then planting that in my mind somehow finds a path to it without necessarily having a clear strategy to do that. It just planting those little seeds often, ends up sending you down that path.
You are an observer, but you bring a stoicism. The philosophy you use is very much stoicism. Can you speak to that? How did that come out?
Well, I didn't even realise that I had that in the back of me until I did that. The latest book I've just done, which is just coming out, called Be Resilient. And like everyone else in the world of COVID, I think everyone else in the world of COVID, we had to figure a way of enduring and then bouncing back. And we were all in it together. So it was quite interesting, I think, that everyone helped each other out, particularly in Australia, which we should give ourselves a bit of credit for compared to lots of other countries. I think we showed a lot of compassion during this COVID period, and other countries turned on each other pretty solidly and have found it a lot more difficult because of that, I reckon. And so I think, the analogy is it's a green, healthy twig, a twig that can blow in the winds and always bounce back.
What's that?
Whereas, that's what I sort of envisage as being resilient, but to do that, you have to have a healthy mind, a healthy body, a healthy spirit kind of thing, a sound one of those. And I also reckon I've figured out of all of this, you also need a plan. You need something to aim for, a plan to give hope and inspiration. And I drew in writing that book on philosophies that went back to ancient Rome and ancient Greece and all the great Stoics, and what they found in their lives all those thousands of years ago is still true today, and that stoicism of being able to sustain yourself and still grow in spite of all of the difficulties. I think that's the thing. I think if we stop growing, we're in trouble. That's what I learned, I reckon.
Stoicism isn't just about growing regardless of what's going on, though. It's about a functional universal model. And there are plenty who today would say there is no such thing.
Well, it's all about...
is completely wrong and should be debunked.
Well, yeah, I think the way I look at stoicism, it's about adaptation. It's about adapting to the circumstances, because a lot of the time we don't control the circumstances, but we do control the way that we react to them. And in many great minds have figured that out over the years and told us about that. And there are some great I've got somewhere one of the quotes that I used in there from Viktor Frankl. That's right, who's a Holocaust survivor, came through the thing that most of us could not have even imagined enduring, and he endured, and he also endured with a spirit that bounced back afterwards. And I'll read that briefly because I kept it there. Between stimulus and response, there's a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom.
It's the only place the growth is.
Yeah. And isn't that extraordinary? And a man who's been through what we can't even imagine has distilled that knowledge down into a couple of sentences. And we can all benefit from that, I reckon. And a lot of us do that without really clearly thinking it through. We just know that's the right thing to do. But a lot of people find it really difficult because they don't give themselves enough credit to be able to make choices themselves. They feel like all the choices have been taken from them. And that's rarely the case. You usually have some options, and that's where your power lies.
They're also being taught that it's not them, that to be offended is a reason for the other person to change, rather than, I was reading your body of work and look forward to chatting with you about it. Back in the days where you drew your inspiration from, nobody would have thought to have been that their offence would be a reason for somebody else to have to change. That just wasn't the mechanics of a conversation. There was a lot more stoicism,
Yes.
I would say, than there is in the Western world today.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons I was drawn to your book, Be Resilient and Thrive, because you did draw so much on philosophy that I love and admire and strive for, because it speaks to mindfulness and pausing before you think and assuming best intentions of somebody else, and of finding a way to navigate the conversation, the narrative together to support somebody's views, the right to have the view, even if you don't support the view. All of these, I speak to such social etiquette that I almost feel old-fashioned speaking about it.
Yeah, no, I think you should. And I think
you feel old-fashioned?
Yeah, I constantly feel old-fashioned, but I'm old, so I'm used to that. I'm happy with that. But you know, what you've done is adapted that to your, our changing world, and you've moved and bounced around but maintained your progress and maintained your course. And that's the trick. The trick is not to stop and be overwhelmed. It's to be able to be resilient by sucking up problems if necessary, learning from them, figuring out what you can take from them, and then bouncing back. It doesn't mean going back to exactly the way it was before. It means making progress still. It means growing still and enjoying things and finding the beauty in life and things like that. And they can't take that away from you. Whatever circumstance you're in, they can't take that away from you. And we've been through this fascinating thing, the Trump thing. People will study that and they'll come back and we'll learn so much from that, because I think one of the things that I realised, because as an old journo, most people with something like the presidency always thought that there was a certain way you did things, and then that was backed up by structures, that there was a good reason that you did them. Well, this bloke came in and, being a massive narcissist all his life, thought that whatever he thought was always the right way to do things, and just did it, right? And as a result of all his actions, people are now looking and going, wow, hang on, that was never a law that you had to do that. That was never properly structured. That was just the way that it had always been done. And they're having to rethink a lot of stuff now and figure out what the valuable bits are and what the extraneous bits are. And maybe he won't have meant to do that, but maybe he's done everyone a big favour, by making
things for himself.
Yeah.
I believe one of the outcomes is that we now question institutions a lot more than we did. We will talk about Gallipoli and Kokoda and some of your beautiful work, but that was a time when institutions weren't questioned. You can't have Gallipoli and question your institutions. It's not possible. Yeah. You would not have lost or have had 500,000 casualties, so 500,000 people on both sides, injured or dead, in one campaign, if we had today's mentality on institutions. Yeah, well, I mean, that was, and we're totally involved as Australia in that campaign, but in the World War I context, that was a sideshow. You had, in World War I, there was 65 million men under arms, 65 million, and 37.5 million were either killed, wounded, taken prisoner, or disappeared. Right, 37.5 million over 4 years. And the scale of that, when you think about it, is just breathtaking. And the impact that had on our nation, young nation, only became a nation, like 10 or 12 years before, 14 years before the war broke out. That, we look at it now, but you can imagine what it must have been like. There wouldn't have been a single family that you knew that wasn't affected in some way. And that's the thing. The same thing in the Second World War. The immense scale of the involvement. When we've got vets today. Or I'm doing a doco at the moment called The Home Front, and it's about the plight of the modern veteran. And their plight's a lot worse in some ways because there's so few of them who have been involved in Afghanistan, Iraq, East Timor, things like that.
and the rest of us haven't had any real involvement at all. So we don't even understand what they've been through. Where my dad was in the Second World War, all of his friends were involved in some way. The whole community was. So it was a community response. The way that the community welcomed them back, the way that everyone grew together and had sort of common experiences allowed people to heal. Whereas these poor guys who are, and women now, which is in my mind even weirder, watching women demanding to be in the front line of fighting, that sort of stuff is coming from my, upbringing and my, whole idea of, I love the idea of equality. I've got two daughters, and a granddaughter who I'm very, very keen to see have equality. But I don't know, it's something makes me pause when who wants equality of women to be fighting, alongside men.
I don't know how I feel about that. There are studies showing that men have paused in war to protect the woman comrade.
Yeah.
I don't know how good the research was. That's all I can draw on.
I find that a very strange concept, and it frightens me in lots of ways, because I always thought that the sensible, compassionate element in our community was largely the female element, and that drives so much good in the community, and I hope that still is maintained, because I think that's where the growth of involvement of women in our communities is improving everything. And you go back, doesn't have to be too far back before you realise, women, even when I left school, a single woman could not get a loan from a bank without having a male guarantee it.
I remember being told at high school, if I went into the public service, I had to resign my position when I got married.
Yeah. Well, it was right into the 1980s.
And I could not join officer training.
Oh, really? You couldn't do that? Wow,
No.
I didn't know that. Well, I did a history of the New South Wales Police Force book, and I didn't know until I did that it was right into the 80s that the same thing applied in the New South Wales Police Force. If a policewoman married, she had to resign right up until the 1980s. It's incredible, isn't it? We just take so much for granted now, but so many people fought those fights over the years to give the freedom that's being enjoyed today. And that's something that's important. That's why I write a lot of those other books, is because we can easily forget the fights that went on to gain the freedoms that we enjoy today if we don't kind of every so often look back at them and see the backstory there. Why did that happen? Who fought?
We'll touch on Gallipoli now. I was going to come to it later, but I have to ask you, what's caused your pathway? How is it you've come to be inspired by so many stories that I believe are of stoicism and of resilience and of personal sacrifice and of bravery, when I believe any reasonable person would have fear?
They all had fear, that's for sure. It's the overcoming of the fear that's the remarkable thing.
Yes, that is so remarkable.
Function, I think where it started by, I used to be originally a newspaper reporter, and it was meeting old diggers that made me realise what a remarkable, and originally First World War diggers, right? That's how old I am, right? So it was originally, I was interviewing First World War diggers, and I realised what a remarkable group they were. And then over the years that they left us, and Second World War diggers, who are almost largely left us now too, I realised what sacrifices that they went through that they very rarely spoke about, and that we took for granted. Well, we just accepted. And so that's why the first book that I sort of did after I got out of TV was about Kokoda, was the Kokoda Campaign, because I'd heard of Kokoda, as most Australians had in their lives at some stage, but I didn't know any of the detail of it. I didn't know how close a call that was for Australia until I started doing interviews. I did documentaries, then I did books on it. And I became friends with a lot of old diggers who sadly, almost all, there are only two who I know who were there, and they're both 100. So, and they're still with us, right? But the rest of them have left now. And so I'm very glad that one of the last docos I did about 2 years ago now was, it was called Kokoda, The Spirit Lives. And it was looking back through the eyes of those diggers at their experiences and what that meant for Australia and how close we were. I mean, a lot of people, I think even today, don't realise that were it not for a couple of individual battles there, Australia would have been totally isolated. They may not have had to actually invade us because they could have just blockaded us and made us. And we would have completely cut off, and we would have been really unable to continue on our own after a certain period. And right up until the Kokoda Campaign, which was in the early and mid stages, right through 1942, we were, concentrating on the other side of the world because we'd sent all our troops over to Europe to fight with Britain and the Allies over there. But, all of a sudden Pearl Harbor happened, and then we weren't prepared, and all our seasoned troops were all away overseas, and we had to try to defend Australia. And it's a fantastic story that the first groups of young diggers who were sent up there were militia troops. That's, like reservists, effectively.
They were kids.
They were kids. Their average age was probably 20, if that, and they'd never fired a shot in anger. And you're always an expert on leadership, right? The leader of that group, by sheer accident, was a bloke named Ralph Honor, Honner. And if it hadn't been for that particular man, I still reckon that it would have been very difficult for those blokes, those young kids, to have put up a fight long enough for them to be reinforced by the other troops who were rushed back to defend Australia. And this guy he's one of the most remarkable men I have ever met in my life. He was a complete Renaissance man. And that's very rare today. He was a fantastic linguist. He spoke 5 languages, and he learnt 3 of them because he knew the war was coming. So he learnt Italian, Greek, and something, what was the other one? French, because he knew the war was coming, right? He was a teacher, then he became a lawyer, then he became one of our finest soldiers during the war. And then after the war, he then became an advocate for veterans. And at one stage, he ended up being our Australia's ambassador to Ireland. He was a great sportsman as a young guy as well. So, this was.
What did he do at Kokoda?
On Kokoda, he turned up after the original commander had been killed in the first skirmishes, and he was rushed off from Australia up to New Guinea. He'd been back in Australia for 2 weeks after being away for 2 years. He had 2 young children and a wife in Perth. He hadn't seen them for 2 years. He had a week and a bit with them, and then he was ordered to go straight up to Kokoda. And in those days, it was like hopping in planes all around the boat, from Perth to Parafields and then to Melbourne to Sydney to Cairns to stuff like that. And then he had to walk in along the Kokoda. Yep, he had to hike in on his own with one sergeant to take over. And he walked into a little battle area there called Isuraba, which is basically, the critical battle of the whole of that campaign, our Alamo, if you like, in Australia. And he had never met any of these kids. They didn't know who he was. He was 37 years old. He walked in there and he couldn't even pull them all together to talk to them as one. He had to go around into their positions and introduce himself and explain to them what they wanted. He was a genius at communicating, and he explained, intersecting fire and defensive positions and stuff. They had no idea what he was talking about initially. But he inspired those kids to hold on for almost 4 days, outnumbered 10 to 1, and until the troops who were rushed up from Australia from the Middle East were able to reinforce them and join them. And had it not been for that caliber of that bloke as a leader, who knows what would have happened? Because if they'd overwhelmed those guys in that early stage, then they would have rolled down the track before the reinforcements could have set up a position to defend it properly. And the whole thing could have changed. And we could have been completely under the control of the Japanese, because if they got to Moresby, that extended the capacity of all their bombers to dominate Australia. And that was the secret. If you had to hold them back out so they couldn't do that, and they did that, they turned them around, they pushed them back to where they landed, and the original landing places are these wonderful little villages, Boona and Gona and Sanananda, and they pushed them back out again. And that saved our freedom in the Second World War. And I come back to Ralph Honour. He was also a wonderful, brilliant historian. He loved history. And his great line, you know, should have made a movie about Ralph many years ago. When he recaptured Gona, he was the commander that recaptured Gona, where the Japanese had originally landed 6 months earlier. And when he recaptured it, he sent back the signal to headquarters, just "Gona's gone." That he was, he's a showman. He just knew exactly how to capture, And this was a guy who, prior to all of that drama, would have been a lawyer. So he was called to do that.
Yeah. One of the things that I was struck by with Kokoda was how far the Japanese had to hike in before the Australians fell back to their Alamo. I looked at the map in preparation for this conversation, how far they had to hike in. And I think that was probably a turning point as well, because in the end, we were able to support and reinforce our supply lines. But what could they do? They had to literally walk the hike, crawl, stagger through the entire Kokoda Trail from the other side of the entire country to get in.
Yes, that's right. And that was what was so we had that problem initially because
we went that way.
Yep. And then as we withdrew,
we have just stayed at the Alamo.
Yes. So when we fought, the major battle was about halfway between the North Coast and the South Coast, and we're talking about a track that goes over the top of a mountain range, which is higher than anything we've got in Australia, right? It's higher than Kosciuszko. So, it runs like a spine right down right down New Guinea's mainland, right? So you have to climb over the top of that. And there was no track. There's no roads, right? It was a track. And both sides didn't realise just how difficult the terrain was. And if like I've been on it many times over the years, and you only have to just spend a day there and your mind turns back to exactly what those poor guys must have gone through. Both sides, there was a terrible, the terrain was the third element in a way in the fight. They
were also, the leaders didn't let the Aussie troops have big artillery. Hindsight.
They couldn't get it in there. They couldn't get it in there.
Yeah.
The Japanese brought these little they called them mountain guns, but they pulled them apart and carried them on their backs.
Yeah.
Well, the Australians just decided that they'd wait. When they got to the bottom end of it all and the Japanese reached the end, the Japanese we'd been fighting a rear guard, taking terrible casualties of the Japanese as they advanced. So by the time they got about 30 or 40 k's away from Moresby, they were completely buggered. They thought that they were going to take 10 or 12 days to actually make Moresby, and they relied on doing that and didn't have the supplies to go any further. And that's what the major turning point was there. Then the Australians were able to push them back. But, it's all that works brilliantly in hindsight.
My vision is perfect right now. Thank you.
Exactly. And that's the problem that at the time, they had to adapt. And it was guys like Ralph Honour who were able to adapt better. The Japanese were very structured in their thinking, and that's why they did these crazy banzai charges. Yeah. And the Australians just went, what is going on? Who would charge into our guns like that? And that's how they had their training was fierce, but the Australians were very adaptable. And I think there's some wonderful lessons learned how, guys who were, privates, corporals, took command of situations because they just stepped into the role of leader. And that's some of these guys then, if they were a postie or whatever they were before the war, after the war, they just came back out and went back into society and resumed their lives pretty much, which I also think is one of the most fascinating parts of their life experience. That they, you know, they didn't then say, okay, I've just spent 5 years being a warrior, I'm going to be a warrior for the rest of my life, you know, this has changed. They didn't. They went back to their families, you know, sure, they had lots of problems and would have had PTSD and similar problems undiagnosed over those years. But they were able, because they had so many mates around them, they were able to absorb a lot of the traumas that they went through and deal with it in a sort of like makeshift way, I think. You know, they actually dealt with it by looking after each other.
Yeah.
And that was
the themes that comes through in your writing and your documentaries.
Yeah, it's because that was the people that I learnt to love. You know, they were the ones I actually met, and I learnt that from listening to them, how they dealt with it. You know, there were guys who I always remember, one wonderful man who he was one of my you know, greatest friends and mentors in many ways, and he came back, and he was a lawyer beforehand, and then he became, at 27. He became a commander of a battalion of, you know, around about 1,000 blokes. He got married in a break during the war. And then when he came back, his wife thought that, oh, well, it's all finished, he'll come back. The very first Saturday after he got back, he got all dressed up. And his wife said, where are you going, Phil? What's happening? And he said, oh, I've got to see some of the blokes. And she said, no, you're back home now. It's all finished. He said, no, some of them are in trouble. And so he went to the local, they didn't have an RSL club in those days, it was a pub in Melbourne. And he went there and had to deal with issues that these guys had, you know, as he used to point out, just because someone's a brilliant soldier doesn't mean they're going to fit in to the society when they get back. Some of the best fighting soldiers had big problems when they got back. He had to deal with that. But the fact was, they all gathered together to do that. And the individuals weren't left on their own to try to figure it out.
Plenty of research showing that post-traumatic stress can be less, not always, if you have people around you who'll hold you and you'll be able to talk about it and process it and not feel ashamed of it. And
I think that's part of the reason that, you know, today seems so much worse, because they are such a small little cohort compared to the community, and they've been through things that even the Second World War and the First World War guys didn't go through. This is repetitive, you know, deployments. Some of them have been up to Afghanistan and Iraq for 7 times. And, you know, all of the experts tell us that, you know, the first time you might get away with it, the second time perhaps, third time you probably won't, fourth, fifth, sixth, you definitely won't, you know. And so you can't keep sending people back into those situations and not damage them. And I feel like it's our responsibility to help when we've sent people to war. I think as a nation and as a government and our structures, it's our responsibility to look after them.
just because you can't see the injury doesn't mean to say the injury isn't there.
Exactly.
So what does our government do?
Well, our government tries, but they're using a system that's really outdated, I think. And that's the thing that's coming to me from interviews and talking to people doing this latest doco on the home front. And it's that the Department of Veterans Affairs, which is a really great structure in many ways, but it was set up after the First World War.
Yep.
Right. And so much has changed in those. And it's almost, from the point of view of modern veterans, they feel it's almost an adversarial relationship between them and the DVA, that they've got to prove everything to the DVA, having been sent away, having been damaged, having come back with physical and mental issues and things like that. They've still got to go through this really bureaucratic process to prove that they need support.
Why?
And some of them just give up,
Why
and
do they do that?
well, it's just because that's the way it's been. It's one of those
Words that fire me up, Patrick, so much. When I hear that's the way it's always been,
that's right.
Me completely wanting to burn it down. That's not a reason for lacking in compassion.
Well, that's true.
Common sense. It's just not a reason for it. It's how we've always done it.
Yeah. Well, that's part of the problem, man. And so therefore you've got like 3,500 ex-service organisations, not-for-profits, all trying to help in that field.
Okay.
You know, and so that has its own problems in spreading, you know, like dissipating effectiveness and things like that. So, and my big argument, my old man was a very big supporter of the RSL, that helped start the local RSL where I grew up and all that sort of stuff. And there are this will give the perfect situation. There's about 80,000 plus men and women who are qualified to join the RSL because they fought overseas. They're proper RSL returned servicemen and women. And out of that 80,000, maybe 1,000 have joined the RSL, right? So they don't feel like the RSL represents them or is relevant to them any longer.
Why?
Because the RSL has not, I think, done its duty. And that the RSL has a lot of money in bank accounts. The RSL is a strange structure. They have the visible thing you see in a lot of states is the RSL clubs, you know, the licensed club where you go and they've got poker machines and sporting things and all that. But underlying that is a sub-branch, which is the proper RSL for the formal RSL guys and women who are returned servicemen. That sub-branch usually originally owned the land on which the licensed clubs grew and all that sort of stuff, right? And a lot of them have literally millions of dollars in bank accounts sitting there, right?
And in real estate.
Yeah. In New South Wales, that figure of all of the branches is between $500 million and $750 million in savings accounts, which could probably create programs and solve problems for almost all of the modern veterans.
Why do they have the money?
They have the money because they inherited it from selling the land.
Why do they have it? Why are they keeping it?
Because their vision's too small. Their vision is that they're looking after that money for the next
generation. Their purpose is not to look after their money. Their purpose is to support returned soldiers.
That's right. And there's the problem.
And that's when purpose just gets lost in process. And this is what drives me nuts, when process takes over the purpose of why it's meant to be there. So you can't be the only person advocating for this.
Oh, no, no way am I the only one. But it's very difficult because they all have autonomy.
Yes, they do.
Yeah, that is the biggest problem. If there was
it's got billions in one, but it's all stored at a vault in Rome. It's all independent.
Yes, with all independent little directors who are, you know, and who ironically now are probably Vietnam veterans, right? Because the Second World War ones have all gone. So, and the Vietnam veterans were treated very badly in many cases by the Second World War, and now they're repeating exactly the same thing to the modern veterans.
So the people who are attracted to go, I never dreamt we'd talk about the RSL, Patrick. I did not know this is where we'd go. But so the people who are attracted to running the RSL are people who want to perpetuate the current faulty purpose.
Yeah, generally speaking.
A bit like politics. It attracts not necessarily the best people that you want governing your nation or your state, but the people who could work in such a toxic environment tend to be the people who go into that environment.
Yeah, and I think a lot of them go in with good intentions, get worn down. And that's been my experience over years as a reporter. And that, you know, you met these guys or girls years ago, bright sparks, you know, great visions, trying to get things done. And they're just ground down by the difficulties involved in bringing people together to get...
To have will to push this through. You need a lot of will to push this through because nothing like this has been done before. Yeah,
and it's a very difficult situation. I'm hoping that the doco I'm working on now is going to highlight those issues, and particularly the one with the RSL, because that's going to require leadership from respected veteran sources, not outside people, you know.
They have to be on the same page.
Yeah, well, it sounds like it's a thing that can be resolved, but they've done many times. They've tried to bring together, you know, all these disparate groups, and it's been so difficult.
Why not one RSL club has got more money than another poor country club? They're going to say, well, why would we contribute so much when you're giving so little? I can see it already.
Yeah.
the power
Well,
structures.
I don't see how they argue, though, that you know, that their primary reason for being is actually to help veterans, and the veterans who need it most at the moment are our modern veterans. You know, who because most of the older veterans are looked after, you know, down the years by Department of Veterans Affairs. The modern ones are the ones with mental health issues, which are in many cases urgent ones, and if they're not resolved, you know, very quickly in many cases, that's where we lose them. That's where they end up just running to despair and taking their own lives. And that's happened unbelievably more times than we know. And there's actually no kind of overall national measurement of exactly how many there are of that. So there's a whole lot of issues involved in this. It's a complicated and really, really sad situation, because these are fine people in the main. You know, they're really impressive. If you go and see our special forces, you know, who look to me like kids, right? They're in their early 20s and stuff, right? You see them, they are the most impressive group of men and women. They really are. And they're capable of unbelievable things. So it's not, that problem doesn't start there. It starts with what is being asked of them. And then what happens after they've been trained to do a certain thing, and then they leave for whatever reason. But the transition period there is.
I was reading a research study, or the summary of a research study. It wasn't the original. And paraphrasing was basically saying that we now can build in statistically they're probably going to come back with issues.
Yeah.
So given the probability is there, this is a probability, not a possibility. We must build into the system a place for them to land.
Yes.
It's not if it happens, it's when.
Yep.
And how serious it is.
Yep.
So that, if that's the narrative we have, we've got to move the benchmark on how we deal with it. Why is it so simple to say this and yet so difficult and overly complicated to bring about?
I think because of the structures. It's a structural thing.
It's not on the RSL though, it's on the government. The government
but the government doesn't have, but the problem is that, you know, the government doesn't have direct control over the RSL. And you know, because of there's a sort of devolution of power and responsibility.
I get that, but the government sent them to war. The government provides the
safety. Yeah. And the government, generally speaking, there are big mistakes, but they're trying to do the right thing. It's not like they're avoiding the situation. Is this the best way to be doing it? And clearly it's not, because
the moment you have someone who's resilient as a soldier giving up on a bureaucratic process, you're not doing it right.
Yeah. Well, they lose in many cases, they feel like they lose their identity once they leave the service.
Yeah.
And it's a clear identity when they're in there. And then when they leave, this is the problem. The problem is there, you know, there's damage, and then there's this transition. And there's the two situations. And lots of people have got ideas about how to do it. But the thing is, it's like massive, and it's a big problem. How are they going to do it? And so that's why I'm hoping this doco will be shining a light on it, so that people understand more about it. They embrace the veterans, because a lot of people today are worried about dealing with modern veterans with mental health issues. So there's an avoidance of it in some ways. And we need to embrace those problems. I mean, we caused them, and we need to embrace the problems and help in whatever way we can. And that's the whole idea of that doco, is to be used as a tool, so that we go to the communities and we say, you know, hey, we can see the problem. Let's work together with our veterans who are part of us, right? Who are part of our families. Let's see what we can do to help it. So I'm hoping that will actually
come out. The movies, the doco you've done is The Home Front. When's it released, Patrick?
Well, we're still shooting now. We started shooting before COVID, so we've been stymied for a year basically. I'm just back shooting now. So tomorrow I've got a big shoot, then I'm down to Tasmania in a couple of weeks' time. And we'll back in it. My aim is still to try to get it out by mid-year. Yeah. So that's our aim.
So I want to ask you about, I'm going to do my best to talk about Gallipoli.
Yep.
I did read your book on Gallipoli, and loved it. I was at a cafe for some of it and had to get comforted by a waiter as I cried. So I've got my tissue ready. I was just asking some of my people here in the team who are very young, do you know about Gallipoli? And none of them did.
Wow. Oh,
Yeah.
I'm surprised.
They've heard of it, but they couldn't tell you about it.
Exactly.
I read A Fortunate Life years ago.
Right.
Absolutely years ago, A Fortunate Life. I remember weeping at that book as well.
Bert Facey.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. To me, Gallipoli is a symbol of the horror of war, but also the courage that comes out in war and the folly of war. I realize it's a tiny campaign in the scheme of who was lost in the First World War and then the Second World War. But to me, it was a microcosm of what it is. And it had, I was just completely blown away. So I'm gambling a little bit because I was completely overwhelmed, not just by the book, but I also watched some of the movie footage that you had, because I think you've got a doc on it as well, haven't you?
No, not on Gallipoli, but I've got, similar. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And I was just completely overwhelmed. It's the only inadequate word I have, Patrick, for what these people had to do. I don't understand how you launch yourself out of a boat with a kit that's too heavy to be in water, risk drowning under heavy fire, trying to reach a point that can't be reached. Everything in my body says no. I just can't get my mind around it.
Well, it was a sense of duty that was imbued in that generation. They were, you know how we're all sort of set up like an app with a basic sort of set of presets, right? Their preset was duty, and as a result of that, they could be told to do things which we think are unthinkable, and they would try, and they did. And the same thing happened. I mean, Gallipoli was an extraordinary experience for Australia, New Zealand, and Turkey. They were the three who really were impacted. And it's wonderful if you ever get the chance to go to Turkey, to go to Gallipoli, because once you get there, there's an aura about the place. The place is largely untouched and unchanged. It's a national park effect now, so you can see it pretty much as it would have been. You also will meet the Turks, who for some reason became our enemies at that stage. And, can you imagine the sort of mindset of a Turk at that stage going, what the hell are these people coming from the other side of the world to our country to try and steal our country from us?
There was so much respect between the two sides, though.
Yes, there was.
That came through so clearly in your book. Let me get the name of the book. Edit, Paul, because I'm fucking around. But what was the name of that book? Gallipoli.
The Spirit of Gallipoli.
It's called The Spirit of Gallipoli?
Yeah, The Spirit of Gallipoli.
On my iPad, I read it yesterday. So in your book, The Spirit of Gallipoli, it came through so clearly that they were enemies in name only. They were going to try and kill each other, but in between, they were going to share cigarettes, and the Turks threw over the tobacco so the Anzacs could throw over the paper, and they stopped and had an armistice, an unofficial one, to smoke.
Yeah.
And then they went back to killing each other. Up to 2,000 men died in less than an hour in one foray the size of 2 tennis courts.
That's right. You can go and see that actual ground. You can see the memorial. It's the Lone Pine Memorial. You can see that. And if you ever go there for an Anzac Day ceremony, that's incorporated into the whole Anzac memorial thing there. Yeah, look, there's just no logical explanation for so many of those things that happened. Gallipoli is symbolic of so many things that we have to endure or had to endure in wars, right?
A chap that had half his face blown off was seen to coolly finish himself off with his rifle. One of his mates was with him at the time. I just can't even imagine what they faced every single day, and it never relented. It wasn't 5 days a week, 38 hours and go home on the weekend. It was under the unrelenting sun, and then it switched to winter. They never got a moment off. It was 24 hours a day, facing this. At one point, the men were climbing over 4 deep in bodies of their comrades to move their position. We have so much to be grateful for.
Yeah, it's terrible that anyone has to go through that, isn't it? It's kind of, when you look back on those things, you just don't understand the impact that that must have had on those men, on their families, on friends of theirs. You know, their lives in those instances are changed forever. If they survive it, you know, it never leaves them. And that's the same, I think, in many, many experiences, even through to today in Iraq and Afghanistan. Same situation. The trauma never actually leaves people, because you don't expect in your life to have to deal with that kind of trauma. You know, I mean, we see it in some extent, to some extent, maybe in our fireys, in bushfires, and the trauma that happens in that, and we can understand that to some degree. But you know, that wasn't a plan to try to take someone's land from them, or to try to, you know, it is extraordinary. I mean, I've
not to diminish fireys at all, because they do experience trauma as a result of what they see and experience and have to deal with. They deal with it once and then they're pulled out.
Yeah, I suppose that's
These
true.
guys were there for months.
Yeah, they were there for 9 months.
9 months, and there was no out. You didn't get a day off. A day off for them was finding their way to the beach, risk being shot to try to get a swim to kill some of the lice that had invaded their bodies and their clothes.
That's true.
It's just the relentlessness of it. The only reason I talk about this and want to speak to you about this is because I'm transposing their experiences. There's so many more that I wrote down to today. And there is institutional folly in Gallipoli. Churchill, what were you thinking?
Yeah. Well, he just thought it was it was supposed to be a clever idea.
It was supposed to be over in a week.
But and it was all predicated on the fact that they thought that the Turks, when faced with that kind of a force, would just fold up, right? But it's the same problem that happened in Vietnam. Yeah, they thought the Vietnamese would give it away. But when you're defending your own country, and as the Turks used to say to me when we would go and research, they'd say, our families were behind us.
Yeah.
You know, they were literally behind us, in the villages behind us. Do you think we were not going to fight to the death to prevent them being taken? You know, so there's this mentality of a lot of these sort of great thinkers like Churchill and stuff. They never consider, or they override the consideration of what it means to the individual in the front line. You know, for what they would see as the greater good of winning the tactical or the strategic victories and things.
And then there was the admiral who hadn't ever led any troop before, who hesitated before bringing reinforcements onto shore by 3 days, which cost us so much. And that level of folly, I find that so disturbing. There's a quote I've got here in your book from a Turkish commander or officer. I don't order you to attack, I order you to die. In the time it takes to die, other troops and commanders can come and take our place. So I'm not looking at this as the Turks were our enemy. The Anzacs were sent there, and some Brits were sent there to do their job. They were told to treat them as an enemy. And the Turks were told, quite rightly, and decided to defend their territory. The enemy status is completely contrived. It is a contrived paradigm. Does that make sense? Just because you're told to shoot at this person doesn't make them an enemy. They're defending their land, their farm, their family.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that was Ataturk that quote. He ended up being the first president of Turkey. Right? That's the scale. That's the caliber of that leader. He was the guy who, in many ways, was the difference between us getting the high ground, which meant controlling the whole beachheads, or not. He anticipated what would likely happen because he was such a good leader. but he risked his own career and even his life by doing it because he disobeyed orders to actually order his troops in there. So, there's always...
For our viewers, the Turks beat us to the high ground by 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Changed the whole trajectory of Gallipoli.
Yeah.
And it's why we had to retreat and eventually evacuate. And the evacuation was remarkable in itself. But for the sake of 10 minutes. But again, I have trouble seeing the Turks. I can't see the Turks as an enemy. One team got to the top of the hill before the other.
Yeah.
It's arbitrary, Patrick, because there's no winners in any of this.
No, well, if you isolate those sorts of situations in every war, it looks absurd. It doesn't make sense, but someone is making an aggressive move and someone's defending it, generally speaking, right? And that we were the aggressors there because we tried to push our way through.
But if we got to the top, we still would have lost as many men, and they would have lost as many men because everyone would have kept fighting anyway. It would have net resulted in 500,000 casualties. Maybe
if we'd got to the top, it would have changed things because we would have had a control of the terrain, and that would probably have meant that the British and the French could bring their ships in, and that would have changed things. But we didn't get it. That 10 minutes that change was because Ataturk was such a clever, brilliant leader, and the inspiration, that guy then became the inspiration of Turkey as a result of his work there, and even now they're becoming much more hard line in Turkey under what's his name, the Prime Minister there at the moment. But when I first went there were Ataturk's portrait, was everywhere, in every shop and everywhere, almost 100 years later, or, 7 or 80 years later.
I've been to Turkey, I've seen, back when it was Ataturk.
Yeah, and so that he as a result of all of the bad things, he brought some good things out of that conflict and modernized the Ottoman sort of approach to things and brought Turkey in as an independent nation and changed a lot of things, So, this is what the thing about adapting. He was a great adaptive leader. He adapted and talk about being resilient. That it was the ultimate in resilience to be able to.
I don't want to disrespect anybody who received the VC Cross at all. I just have trouble distinguishing who would get the VC Cross in that conflict.
Well,
I really do. And that is in no way to take anything away from any of the recipients at all.
Yeah.
I honour them and, I'd shake their hand today if they'd have me. I just have trouble distinguishing between the Simpson story and any of the other stories I read.
Yeah.
Every single one of them. So Kisa, for example, who spent, I think he's a lieutenant or he was a corporal. I apologise for not recalling his exact rank. I should have written it down. For 50 hours straight, that man threw grenades so the Turks would chuck a grenade in, and he ran around smothering them with sandbags, his own coat, or chucking them out. For 50 hours straight, that's what he did. I simply can't comprehend. What about Jax, another soldier? Jacko. Sorry.
Jacko. Jacko was, a legend in Melbourne. He became a legend. He became the Lord Mayor of St Kilda. He was an extraordinary character. But you're right. Look, as a principle, the problem with all of those awards is that the Victoria Cross has really tight regulations about who, can be awarded one. And part of it is that it has to be seen by someone of responsible rank, So
how did it miss Simpson?
Yeah,
they had to be due to not see that man day after day from 6
a lot of people
save lives in live fire.
Yeah, well, there will be countless numbers in all of these wars. One of the old diggers I used to love, he used to say, and it was he said everyone should have got a gong. They call them gongs. They said everyone should have got a gong for turning up.
Yes, that's what when I read the book is like. Everyone here needs to be acknowledged for the heroes they are.
Exactly, and I think look, in the whole Kokoda campaign, there was one Victoria Cross awarded, and that's crazy, right?
Yeah.
But they used to have, for all kinds of, I don't understand reasons, they had limits on awards, especially in the Second World War. In that
So
campaign,
much courage and sacrifice and humility.
you'll get
and
no argument from me. I know
Yes.
that.
Well,
no
it
question.
really touched me. It really touched me. We need to keep moving. I'm reluctant to leave this because I still had so many other notes. I want to acknowledge the 3rd Anzac Brigade as well for being the first off and to face the ordeal they faced. So being one of the first off in that campaign meant they undertook the most fire. They were meant to provide coverage. They lost so many men just in that very first move. And I'll acknowledge the men who still got off who still did the charge. The first charge completely got shot down, the second charge, the third, and the fourth.
Yeah, right. We talk about
Fourth
courage.
still went.
That's courage beyond
I just
comprehension. That I mean, there's a lot of diggers have often explained to me, said that in certain circumstances, most people could turn into very brave characters hot-bloodedly. You know, if someone attacks someone you love, someone attacks someone who is your close mate, whatever, and you go nuts and then you attack, right? That's brave. That's brave enough, right? That's mad brave as well. But knowing, either waiting and waiting and waiting, right? Or being like one of the coast watchers and being 24 hours a day being hunted by Japanese in the Second World War, that kind of cold-blooded courage in some ways is even more laudable. You know, it's even more remarkable, I reckon. And those guys you're talking about, the ones who attacked, knowing that the ranks in front of them had already been decimated, right? And yet
they didn't make it 10 meters.
Yeah, and they still charge. That
4 different charges, 4 different groups of men climbed out from their tunnel and charged.
Yeah.
Just to add to the body count.
And when the whistle went, they charged.
And
that is almost impossible to conceive.
It is impossible for me to comprehend.
Yeah.
And I do wonder if we could ask the same of people today. And I really question it. And it's not to question people's bravery, it's to question our sense of duty to institutions that we don't feel the same way about today.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I'm not 100%. I believe from my experience, just talking to, like young veterans.
Put aside dedicated soldiers. I'm talking about being drafted.
Right, yeah. Yeah.
I know dedicated soldiers and I know they don't flinch. Yeah. They're going forward. But imagine a draft in Australia today. And 19-year-olds travelling from Sydney to Adelaide, as some of the people you spoke about did, and then to Melbourne to try and sneak their way in because they had an issue or they were too young, trying to get onto the battlefield and then insisting on going over with their mate or saying, can I stand next to my mate Jim because I know this is where we're going to die and I want to be with him when we go. Yep. We would question, I'm so sure we would question it today and say, you go.
Yeah.
Why? Why would I go to get shot down? What is it winning us? 1 meter? Or am I just being too rational and I'm not in battle?
Yeah. I think it depends on whether they felt like their families were at risk. I think if modern Australians felt that they had to fight to save their families, I think they would fight exactly the same as their predecessors.
In Turkey?
No.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
No, but that's another world. You see, they didn't. That most of those people, or a lot of them, hadn't even been to the Big Smoke. No. Right, the First World War.
No,
they lived in the bush, or a third of them roughly came off the land, and many of those would not have travelled outside their state. So this was the world's greatest adventure.
Yeah.
Apart from it, and everyone thought it was going to be over pretty quickly, and none of them wanted to miss out on it.
No, exactly.
So there was all of that kind of pressure to do and be part of the team and all that. That's another world, the sort of global village we live in today has changed that.
Yeah.
And social media has changed.
Social media has changed that. Social media means we're never putting it back in the box. It can't ever go back to an innocent time when legacy media decided the message. Back in the day when you were a journalist, you were part of legacy media. You were the voice. Now there's 10,000 other voices right behind yours giving a contrary message and none of them agree. We don't even agree on the facts now, let alone how to get to a point on the facts. We don't even agree what the facts are.
It's very true. And you know, for better and worse, because at least we could argue on the facts previously.
Yes.
Now it's very difficult to have a rational argument when you're giving alternative facts and, you know, basically just a group of people can absolutely lie, just barefaced lie to you. And even when you can prove that they're lying, they'll still keep lying, you know, and that's pretty astonishing. So, I mean, we used to be able to find out when, you know, we were being lied to, and if we found out we were being lied, we could shine that light and force.
You were required to have 2 to 3 sources. You had to be able to support any claim you made in journalism with 2 sources minimum, ideally 3. Now nobody has to have a journalistic standard. It can be written as a journalistic piece, and be an editorial, and it's passed off as reporting, but it's not reporting.
It's an infuriating thing to watch. For me, I find it, you know, watching the whole of the Trump, say the last 2 years in particular of Trump in America, where they just completely suborned the truth, and they completely avoided any responsibility or basically closed out the media. And that, to me, you know, the first changes that came in with Biden were holding press conferences and answering questions. Radical, you know, I mean, just doing something quite normal like that, and all of a sudden it was almost palpable. You could see America going, oh, thank God, you know, at least I reckon, human nature being what it is, I think slowly that will change. I mean, I don't understand. There's many things I don't understand in life. One of the biggest ones is why anyone would support a bloke who has been a liar for 50 years, who has scammed people as a living all his life, right? Not now, not just now, right? This is a guy who has had form forever, right? Why would you think he is going to look after you as one of
institutions didn't? And let's be clear, I'm not a Trump supporter, but nor am I a Biden supporter. So I would have real trouble being American and voting today. And I'm definitely not a Trump supporter, but I'll give it a shot. Institutions, Obama was meant to deliver the working class Rust Belt something more than he did. And I'm not putting it all on Obama. The degradation of economic opportunities in the Rust Belt's been dying for decades. Every manufacturing plant that moves overseas is a bunch of working class men who don't have a job and can't retool into freaking IT. They can't do it. So
wait a minute, go back one step. What you're forgetting about Obama, for example, is that he at no stage in 2 terms had control of the Senate.
He did for the first 2 years.
Well, for marginally, right?
Yeah,
okay, but so everything he put up to try to do things was destroyed, right? And then he was blamed for doing nothing. So, I mean, he was on the ultimate hiding to nothing in a way.
That's why we blame Obama. I put all the institutions in the same basket of ineptitude and indifference. I put them all, they're so worried about their political.
Yeah, what I don't understand over there is the Republican Party's surrender. I just don't understand how they have had a collective, you know, backbone bypass. And they there's not one person who's got, you know, well, there's 3 or 4 people who put their hands up to fight out of all of the people who've been supposed to be representing their nation, right? And I just don't get that. I don't understand it because it's not, it's you know, my culture, my background, my understanding of, you know, looking after people, just it fights everything I believe in to see those people follow a complete charlatan, just, you know, a guy who's like, he's not a charlatan for the last 4 years. He's not a charlatan.
He's pretty consistent. Here's what you see.
Yeah.
He's not changing.
And having come from television, just the fact that this guy fronted a poxy show for, you know, 10 years and somehow as a result of that gained credit from, 60, 70 million people just astonishes me. I know how.
Say it a little differently. The fact that they did is worth conversation. There is something there to it, Patrick. The fact that 75 million people, and that's not counting the people who couldn't be effed voting. There's a whole bunch more who silently support it. There has to be a reason, and just being astonished isn't enough. And what I'm so disappointed about with the Democrats is their lack of introspection, their lack of ability to say to themselves, well, okay, well, this did happen. It did happen for one term, and it nearly happened for a second term. We are being told something. We are being told that we are not taking care of the constituents that feel there's no home to them anymore with them. Democrats are meant to represent Labor, working class, the underdog, the person who can't retool into IT. If I hear that one more time, that these people who just average Joe blows, more power to them, struggling to pay their mortgage, will never send their kids to a private school, are in danger if they have a mortgage of losing their rental property, maybe live in a caravan, being told to retool. Patrick, we can't just keep saying we're astonished. At some point, we've got to be saying there's something going on here we're being told and we're not listening. And I get tired of intellectual elites acting like this is just shocking and not somehow something we need to address. They are invisible to the institutions. That is so tragic that the most powerful nation in the world, about to become the second most if it keeps this shit up, can't be honest about these people that are being ignored. And it breaks my heart because I'm seeing this beautiful nation rip itself apart unnecessarily. And just because I'm gonna rant, before we blame Republicans too much about getting behind Trump, let's talk about Zuckerberg. Let's talk about every IT left-winger who gave that man $1 billion of free coverage in the first election and primary. They chucked so much free media at him. How could you not consider to vote for him? We didn't know how it was going to. Literally, the entire legacy media threw everything to him. His entire speeches would get played whilst Hillary would get 2 minutes of highlights.
Hang on. How do you tell me that you didn't know how it would work out? Bullshit. You're going to tell me you didn't think Trump would act as Trump?
Oh, yes. I just don't think the voters realised how.
Oh, okay, all right. The voters might.
Yeah,
well,
I'm giving all credit that the voters.
What bit of him changing did anyone?
No. Moving past that, he hasn't. What I'm saying is, a voter doesn't have to be as informed about this as I've made myself. Like, I really do study this. The average voter just goes along and picks the person who seems to be most interested in them. Yep. In their economic situation, in their social situation. And I just see these IT groups threw everything behind them, and they basically gave him a free $1 billion campaign. Patrick, that's incredible in the history of campaigning. That has never happened. It's not surprising he had a shot at the title.
No, it's not. And these guys are the same people who claim the high ground in morality, that we do no harm, and that, this. Hey, don't get me started. I can't get
started. In it when it was great ratings, and now they've abandoned him and kicked off Twitter when the ratings are going down. There's
also an element, I think, of this has gone far enough too.
Yes.
Right. I mean, I think it's, who knows what could have happened if they'd caught, for example, if they'd run across Nancy Pelosi or they'd run across Pence, just by accident in that, because those lunatics are all yelling in the background, hang him, kill him, shoot him, do. They had, they've got the IQ of plant life, most of them, and pushed together in that mad situation. They could have killed someone. They did kill someone.
Huh?
I was saying they could have killed someone, but they actually did kill people. So.
People did die. Have you read The Madness of Crowds by Douglas Murray?
No.
I'm going to recommend it to you. One of the things I'm most fearful of, which Douglas speaks about, is mobs. And I think everybody's IQ goes down in a mob.
Yes.
And it's left wing or right wing. It's not about.
No, that's proven.
You're in a mob, IQ's going way plummeting down to 80 or so, and decisions now. The process is hijacked.
Which is exactly the risk they ran there, and the risk. It was pretty lucky that it wasn't way, way, way worse than it than it was, really, because
And the police the capital was so underprepared. They were warned about this. They knew, and they still acted like it's beyond me.
I can't get, there's too much stuff I don't understand over there. Too much.
So I think we did an okay job of doing Gallipoli some justice and Kokoda. I don't know that I've done justice to your beautiful work, but to bring this home, there's a couple of things in Be Resilient and Thrive that I thought I'd throw your way for you to comment on to wrap up.
Okay.
And I did watch a previous interview of yours, and so I'll share with the viewers. You've written, I think it's 6 in this series?
7 now.
7, congratulations.
Yeah.
You've got another one coming out now, haven't you?
No, that's the latest.
That's it.
That's
Be
out.
Resilient and Thrive is the most recent. And this was inspired by having optimistic messages that are worthwhile for your grandchildren.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So here's one. Curate your thoughts. Not all thinking is rational. Sometimes we need to take a critical look at it. Have we simply adapted another's viewpoint? Is our mood driving our thinking? Have we rushed to a conclusion? Don't treat all thoughts equally. And one of my favorite sayings is the moment is your feelings aren't based on facts, and facts don't care about your feelings. And so I read this. Would you like to comment a little bit more on this?
Yeah, I think that's actually, well, our brains are shaped by our experiences. So, our experiences set up sort of little responses, automatic responses in our brains. And sometimes I think the thing is we need to step back, just pause, put everything on pause for occasionally before we react, before we jump in and just react immediately. And then the point I was making in that is that not all thoughts, when we go back over them, are equal. Some thoughts are pretty dumb and some thoughts are really clever. And in the heat of the moment, sometimes it's very difficult to distinguish between them. So that's the point there. In those books, what I've done is they're always the same pretty much through the whole series, is there's a theme, and a theme backed up by a quote from someone, wisdom from the ages, way smarter than me. And in almost every single case that I could, in every case of anything I've ever thought of, someone's already thought of that before and much smarter than me. And so, but it always underlines it and gives it sort of support to the idea. And in that case, I'm just saying that we've got the choice to deal with the experiences in our brains in different ways. So when all of our thoughts, just think about what you're planning to do before you're rushing off and doing it.
Turn social media off. If you want to be able to think,
exactly.
You've got to turn social media off, because it's not a source of thinking. It's basically everybody in the village square yelling at each other. And
not only that, the algorithms feed you with stuff they think you're already,
Have you seen the movie Social Dilemma?
Yeah. Yes, I have. And that's so amazing, isn't it? It's a wonderful little doco.
Oh,
that's the point, that they think, and they often are right about what our predispositions are, what we really think. So they're going to feed that.
Yeah.
And therefore, you can push yourself into a little vacuum where you think everyone agrees with me, because all my social media, connections all agree with me. And I think maybe that's part of that thing that's happening in America with that thing we're talking about with Trump, that everyone feels like we're all in agreement with this, because the 20 or 30 that Facebook feed to you, generally speaking, agree with your themes, your thoughts. And that's crazy. That I think is the secret there, though, that you have to be an independent thinker, but you've also got to evaluate your thoughts.
Yes.
Don't rely on all the stuff that's coming, particularly in social media, because that's already,
It's created to control you, to get your eyeballs to stay there. It is literally a machine designed to keep your eyeballs there, to see as many ads as possible.
Exactly. It's the same principle as getting you to sit down and stay at the poker machines.
Yes, it is.
Yeah,
It really is. I have to stay off social media because I can tell I'd be addicted. I definitely would go into poker. I've never been on a poker machine, but I imagine that feeling of just what's next.
Yeah.
And so I just have to help my mental health. Exactly. To wrap up, Patrick, what inspires you?
What inspires you? Above all, I'm a big optimist. I can't help it. That's definitely built into me, probably from experiences and things. At the moment, I'm totally inspired by my grandkids because I see that amazing promise and potential and hope and innocence and love. And above all else, that inspires me at the moment. And I just delight in the time that I have sitting and talking to them and, playing with them and things like that. And they're 6 and 4. So they're at a really interesting transition age as well. Lukey's just started school last year. He's into his second year of school. And Sophia is the strong-willed one. She's quite a remarkable girl. And, some people, you have some kids, they seem to have been here before. They have that sort of experience. You go, how did you figure? And that she's one of those. So that's what inspires me. But also just trying to adapt. I love the idea of adapting to change. I mean, I'm sure in humanity, in history, we've never been exposed to greater, faster, more dramatic changes as humanity than in history. And so the secret to thriving and surviving and being resilient is being able to adapt to the changes and understand, that these changes have this multiplicity of effects. You've got to kind of observe, try to use the wide angle lens and see what is happening all around you. It's amazing what is happening in our lives. And if you look at sort of, some of those great brains, like Sapiens, the book Sapiens, where they looked at this massive scale of things and the changes, you realise that the rapidity of change, that had started going, over many years long at that kind of angle, and now it's like
the curve just went along, and then
and we're in this, we're trying to deal with exactly. And so the most important thing is you can't stay still, right? You can't mark time and think that you're not going to be just buffeted around and lose control of the situation. You must adapt. And as far as I'm concerned, because everything I've done in my career, newspapers, television, books, they bear no resemblance to what they did when I first started in them. So they have completely dramatically changed. And I could see that newspapers were going to change back in the 70s. So that's why I got out of that. And then into TV. Well, I didn't see TV was going to change as dramatically as TV changed. But books, books probably didn't change for 200 years previously to the last, say, 20. But over that last 20 odd years, books and publishing is completely unrecognisable as well. So, but I look at it and I think, look at the opportunities that are there. That's where I see. I just look for the opportunities that are opening up as the changes happen. For example, docos, you could make a doco and then you'd put it up the mast at one of the networks and that'd be it, right? And it'd go to air once and then it's gone. Now you've got streaming.
Yeah.
Now, so that documentary, whatever it might be, lives on Netflix, or it lives on DocPlay, or it lives on Amazon Prime, or whatever it is. And that is a fantastic opportunity. And it's just in its own way. And then books are living things now. So that when previously a book was written and maybe you get an updated edition or whatever, well, you could now, in your game, for example, your books should just be like a living entity that changes as things change. People can download the latest ebook,
the latest one, or the latest course that goes with it, or they can go trading as a result of it.
Exactly, and that's, to me, that's so. What do you take out of that? You take out of the optimistic approach to wherever these things are changing. Somewhere there's another opportunity for you to expand and learn more. Over COVID, I've had to teach myself to shoot video properly. I've been doing it for 30, 40 years, watching great cameramen. But when we couldn't travel, I started shooting my own stuff. So I taught myself lighting, and I reckon that's I just love that opportunity. I mean, that wouldn't have happened to my father. So,
One of the things I'm noticing about you is you have the capacity to think through consequences and to make lateral jumps between how one thing connects to another. That is a rare ability, Patrick.
Okay.
So I think a lot of your
so rare. I've had to do that, I think, throughout my life. And as a journo, you tend to do that. That is a thing you learn.
Yes.
There are certain skills you learn. One is reading upside down across a desk. That's a very useful skill. And there are other things that you learn, when you walk into offices, the way that the office is all set up, and it hasn't been changed, the entrance has never been changed, or you go into a club and they've got the club champion 1995 up on the wall. Jesus, this place needs a shaker. It's all observing things. Observing can, really give you an opportunity to...
You do more than observe, though. You observe and then extrapolate what that could mean.
Yeah.
That's where it becomes rarer. Because everybody would say they're observing. You know what to do with what you observe. That's why you're able to be so creative.
Well, maybe, there's observing and there's seeing and observing. They're not...
okay.
Observing does have that second dimension to it. Okay, you've seen it. What are the implications?
Yeah. Well, what are the elements? Firstly, it's what are the elements that I need to consider? So what is crucial or criteria for me to do anything with this information? Then once I've got the criteria, then what you do is figure out how the criteria relates.
Yeah.
Then you figure out as a result of it what may happen. That's how I believe you do a creative process, just observing what you've been chatting about in the podcast.
Well, it's and that's fascinating, isn't it? The whole concept of the spark of creation. And I think, I've never done proper courses. Mine's always been a more practical approach of doing it, living it, and doing it myself. And I think everyone has that capacity. Everyone has the capacity to be creative. I've always argued against, how you, particularly in agencies, there were the creatives and then there were the others in the agency. Everyone's creative.
Everyone's creative. Some of them have it very much discouraged in use.
Yeah, and a lot of kids, if you see kids, like going back to the grandkids, they're all creative. And then it's often taught out of them. I think I got lots of optimism about future generations. I don't have a really pessimistic approach about our lives. I think we're improving lots of stuff, and I reckon studying history proves it too.
Yes.
When you compare it to the past, and
Stephen Pinker's book where he talks about how on pretty well every metric we're better off today than we were just.
Yeah. And we're just, it's human nature to want the better always, but be fair about it and be, balanced about it. We're doing so well compared to so many other nations. And look at the way we've responded to the pandemic, as a nation, extraordinarily well, but even the globe, at least everyone tried to come together to try to work with it, right? Well, that wouldn't have happened, but mainly because of the lack of communication.
I give communication. I'm going to give everybody a pass on every previous pandemic.
Yeah.
Because literally the Americans in the Spanish flu were not told they had the Spanish flu.
Yeah.
And it didn't start in Spain, by the way. It started in America. For viewers were thinking they're blaming the Spaniards. It wasn't them.
Well, we lost heaps of diggers from the First World War who were heading home. And were caught up in the flu, and then it came to Australia too. Yeah, look, I am optimistic about things, and so and I'm inspired by that kind of level of optimism. I just think that if we constantly look for the good things around us, and if we constantly enjoy the beauty around us, then it sparks your creative juices, and you just blend that in with a bit of compassion. And
your body of work definitely is testament to that.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you.
Thank you so much for coming on our podcast. I know I get lots out of it.
Thanks, Sharon. I appreciate it, mate. It's lovely. It was a great chat. Thank you.
Hey, I really trust you enjoyed this podcast and this conversation with Patrick. He is a phenomenal human being and a very, very compassionate man. I'm a big fan of his work, and researching this podcast and getting to know his work and getting to know him has been a real joy. I was in a cafe, I think it was only yesterday, and I was crying reading the book, just the Gallipoli. just overwhelmed, the Spirit of Gallipoli, the stories there that we didn't get to cover in the podcast as much as I'd like. So I do recommend that you go and read either his book, The Spirit of Gallipoli, or a book, maybe A Fortunate Life as well, just to get a sense of what it was back then. I can't say I'm a history buff, but I am a buff of philosophy and of social patterns. And I do wonder if we had the draft today, what our response would be, what our nation's response would be to that. And back then, the draftees were celebrated, and if they volunteered, they were celebrated, and they traveled around the country trying to find a way to get in. And I appreciate the cynicism and the questions we ask today about the folly of war and the folly of sacrificing ourselves in another land for a piece of land that we've never heard of before. And in no way is that to disparage or take anything away from soldiers who volunteer and go and support and defend our nation and important places that need defending. I'm really just so honoured that they do that for us every single day. My question is about drafting. How would we be? What would we say? What would we do? How would we look at it? What would social media say? What new divides would be created in social media as one silo was against it and one silo said it was your national duty? When I think about how few people know of the story of Gallipoli today and know what it meant for those diggers, what they lost and what they did and what they sacrificed and what they had to do, so few people know about it. And that isn't lecturing anybody that they should know about it. It's just we have this gap now of the realities of what this is. So I do question how it would be if we ever were asked to draft. Would women go? Who would draft? Who would think that they were a conscientious objector? All the rules about what we believe about institutions and what they can ask of us now has changed so radically from this 100 years ago. Interesting questions. I do love interesting perspectives. I trust you enjoyed it.